The docking port at Calyx Station smelled like burnt coolant and something worse, something organic and scared, pressed together in too small a space. Cal Morrow had learned to ignore smells like that. You had to, out here. You learned to keep your eyes on the fuel gauge and your hands on your wallet and your mind on the next jump coordinate, and you did not look sideways at the cages stacked 3 deep against the far wall of the market sector. He was looking sideways at the cages. "Don't," said Petch. Petch was Cal's co-pilot, navigator, mechanic, and on bad days his conscience. He was a squat, heavily built man from the mining colonies of Praxis IV, with forearms like hydraulic pistons and a face that had stopped being surprised by anything about 15 years ago. He was holding a fuel line manifest in one hand and a styrofoam cup of something warm in the other, and he had not looked up from the manifest, but he knew. "I'm not doing anything," Cal said. "You're making the face." "I don't have a face." "Cal," Petch finally looked up. His eyes were the flat gray of old engine casings. "We have 1,100 credits. Fuel to the Tessarine corridor costs 940. That leaves us 160 credits for food, docking fees, and whatever goes wrong between here and there. Something always goes wrong." "I know the math." "Then stop looking at the cages." Cal looked at the cages. There were maybe 30 of them, stacked in a rough pyramid against the curved inner wall of the market bay, each 1 meter by 2 meters of wire mesh bolted to a steel frame. Most held creatures Cal vaguely recognized, Veth lizards, which were considered a delicacy by the Korathi Combine, and spindler beetles, which ground down into a protein paste that kept half the outer stations fed. The market bay was technically legal. The Korathi Combine ran the station, and the Korathi Combine had decided, decades ago, that anything which could not present itself before a legal tribunal and argue its own sapience was fair game for commerce. It was a convenient legal standard. It was also, Cal had always privately thought, the kind of standard that said a lot more about the people writing it than the creatures it classified. He had been navigating around that standard for 11 years. Most cargo runners did. You learned the geography of the outer systems the way you learned any landscape, not the kind you see on maps but the kind you feel in your gut, the contours of what was permissible and what wasn't, the places where the law bent so far it was just a different word for no law at all. Calyx Station sat in the middle of that geography, a hub point at the intersection of 4 trade corridors, run by the Korathi Combine with the cheerful efficiency of an organization that had decided property rights were the only rights that mattered. 3rd cage from the top, 2nd column from the left. She was pressed into the back corner of it, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around them. She was approximately humanoid, bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, roughly the same mass as a human teenager, though Cal had no idea how alien biology mapped to age. Her skin was a deep blue-gray, faintly iridescent in the dock lights, with bioluminescent patterns running along her temples and the backs of her hands that pulsed slowly, like something trying to breathe. Her eyes were large and dark, and absolutely fixed on Cal. Not on the market, not on the crowd, on him. Specifically on him. He wasn't sure how he knew that. The market bay was busy, half a dozen Korathi merchants moving between the stalls, a cluster of Venish buyers in their characteristic pressure suits examining something in the far corner, a few independent traders like Cal himself who had come in for fuel and provisions and were staying, as sensible people did, well clear of the livestock section. There were plenty of things to look at. She was looking at him. "She's looking at me," Cal said. "Don't anthropomorphize. She's sapient." "Cal." "Petch, she's sapient." He said it quietly, not as an argument, just as a fact that needed saying aloud. "Look at the way she's holding herself. That's not animal behavior. That's someone who knows exactly where she is and exactly what's going to happen to her, and is trying very hard not to show how scared she is." Petch looked. He had the expression of a man who was committed to not getting involved in something and was slowly losing the argument with himself. He looked for maybe 15 seconds, which was longer than he needed to. "Yeah," he said finally. "Okay, she's sapient. What are they listing her under?" Petch walked to the nearest market terminal and scrolled without enthusiasm. His expression got flatter as he read. Jari, outer rim species, uncontacted pre-legal classification. He stopped. "Listed as what?" "Premium protein grade," Petch said. "She's going to the Venice processing station in the Calyx belt. Scheduled pickup in 4 hours. The silence between them had weight. Cal did the math he'd been doing since he first saw her. 940 for fuel, 160 left over. He checked the market terminal. Ajari, uncontacted, premium grade, was listed at 2,300 credits. He was 1,200 and some change short. "There's a cargo run," Petch said, and Cal looked at him because Petch was not the kind of man who said things for no reason. "What cargo run?" "I saw it on the board when we came in. Short haul, Calyx to Venice corridor, medical supplies non-perishable. They're offering 1,400 credits because nobody wants to run that leg. There's been Korathi inspection activity, and most carriers don't want their holds searched." "Our hold is clean." "Our hold is clean," Petch confirmed. "It would also take 6 hours to complete the run and come back. Pickup for the Jari girl is in 4. Cal stood very still. He was 34 years old and he had been running freight in the outer systems for 11 of those years, and he had gotten very good at not making decisions like this one. The outer systems were full of situations that looked like choices and were really just traps, things that seemed like moral questions, but were actually just ways to get yourself killed or broke or both. You learned to recognize them and walk away. You learned to keep moving. Stopping was how you died out here, one way or another. He thought about the girl in the cage. He thought about the way her bioluminescent patterns pulsed, slow and deliberate, like a clock that hadn't stopped yet. He thought about the 4 hours before the Venice shuttle arrived. He thought about a lot of things in about 3 seconds, and then he stopped thinking and started calculating, which was different. "Can we get the cargo run paid up front?" he asked. Petch stared at him. "Cal. Half up front, 700 credits. That's enough with what we have to cover her listing price. We pick her up now. We do the cargo run. We use the second half to fuel up before the next jump. And if they don't pay the second half, then we're broke and stuck in the Calyx system with an alien passenger we can't communicate with, and a fuel tank that won't get us to the Tessarine corridor." "Right," Petch said, "so that's the downside. Do you have a better idea?" Petch looked at the cage. He looked at the fuel manifest. He looked at the cargo board on the terminal, and Cal watched him run the same math, and watched him arrive at the same place, with the same reluctance and the same conclusion. "The cargo company is called Vellum Transit," Petch said. "Bay 12. I'll go talk to them." "You go talk to the market handler." He picked up his cup, drained whatever was in it and dropped it in the nearest recycler. "And Cal, when this goes wrong, and it will go wrong, I want it on the record that I told you not to look at the cages." "Noted," Cal said. He was already walking toward the market handler's desk. The market handler was a Korathi, which meant he was roughly 2.5 meters tall, covered in iridescent scales that shifted between copper and green depending on the light, and wore the expression common to all Korathi merchant class. The expression of someone who has decided that everything in the universe is a transaction waiting to be concluded. His name was Vasek, according to the desk placard, and he regarded Cal the way Cal imagined a snake might regard a mouse that had wandered in asking about real estate. "The Jari," Cal said. "Third cage, second column." Vasek's tongue flickered. "Sold," he said. His translator implant rendered his voice as a flat baritone. "Venice processing, pick up in 4 hours." I know, I want to buy her before they pick her up. Vasek's scales shifted toward copper, which Cal had learned from years of dealing with Korathi meant skeptical amusement. You want to purchase a premium-grade Jari. That's what I said. The listing price is 2,300 credits. I know the listing price. I'm prepared to pay it. The scales flickered. Vasek's large, faceted eyes moved from Cal's face to his clothing, worn flight jacket, scuffed boots, the general appearance of a man who was not carrying 2,300 credits anywhere on his person. Payment must be in full, in advance, in certified transfer. Of course. Cal put his credit chip on the desk. He had done the math 3 times on the walk over, and the math kept coming up the same, which meant he was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid, and he wouldn't know which for another few hours. I have 740 credits liquid. My co-pilot is currently negotiating a partial advance from Vellum Transit for a cargo run. Once that transfer clears, I'll have the remainder. Vellum Transit, Vasek said. Yes. Vellum Transit is not a certified Calyx station payment partner. Cal kept his face very still. I'm aware. I'm asking you to hold the listing for the transfer window. I don't hold listings. I'm asking you to make an exception. Vasek's tongue flickered again, and this time the scales went flat, which meant the conversation was over. The Jari is sold to Venish Processing. If you wish to outbid, you may contact Venish directly and arrange a private resale once the transaction completes. He turned back to his terminal with the finality of a door closing. I suggest you leave the market floor if you do not intend to make a purchase. Cal stood there for a moment. The thing about a door closing in his experience was that it was almost always a door, not a wall. Walls didn't close. Walls were already closed. A door meant there had been an opening, which meant the question was not whether there was a way through, but whether you were willing to find it. How much, he said, is your holding fee? Vasek paused. The scales shifted again, this time to something that Cal, optimistically, read as recalculation. My what? Your holding fee. For a temporary market hold pending payment transfer. I assume you have a rate. A very long pause. Vasek's tongue flickered twice. He was running something, numbers or precedents or the probability that this persistent human would actually produce the payment. 200 credits per standard hour. Minimum 2 hours. Cal put down his chip. I'll take 2 hours. Charge me 400. Start the clock now. He walked away before Vasek could change his mind. Petch came back from Bay 12, looking like a man who had just eaten something that didn't agree with him, but was determined not to admit it. 750 up front, he said. They pushed back on 700. I got them to 750 by agreeing to expedited delivery, which means we can't stop at Relay Point 4. We weren't planning to stop at Relay Point 4. I know that they don't. Petch handed Cal a transfer confirmation. The money's in. What did you do? Bought a 2-hour market hold. How much did that cost? 400 credits. Petch closed his eyes very briefly, the way he did when he was running numbers that he already knew he wasn't going to like. So we have 740 of our own credits, plus 750 from Vellum, minus 400 for the hold, minus 2,300 for the Jari, minus 940 for fuel, minus docking extension fees, which I am guessing you forgot about. I forgot about docking extension fees. We're going to be very broke, Petch said. We're going to be exactly broke, Cal said, which is different. How is that different? Broke means you can get less broke. Very broke means you're already on a trajectory. Petch looked at him for a long moment with the flat gray eyes. Did you just make that up? Yeah. It doesn't actually mean anything. It helped me feel better for about 4 seconds. Let's go get the girl. Getting the girl was, technically, straightforward. The payment transferred. The market handler released the cage to a loading corridor, and Cal and Petch brought her out through a service exit that smelled like hydraulic fluid and stale recycled air. The cage was locked with a standard Korathi market seal, which Petch cracked in under 40 seconds with the multi-tool he kept on his belt for the same reason he kept a spare fuse pack and a laminated copy of outer system docking codes. Because things that should be simple were usually slightly more complicated than advertised. The girl did not move when the cage opened. She stayed in the corner, knees drawn up watching them. The bioluminescent patterns on her temples and hands had gone very still, no longer pulsing, just a faint, steady glow, like something holding its breath. Cal crouched down to her level. He'd done enough non-standard freight in his 11 years to know that you didn't crowd a frightened creature, and sapient or not, the body language here was unmistakable. He kept his hands visible and open, and his voice low. "We're not going to hurt you," he said. He knew she didn't speak standard. He said it anyway, because the tone of a voice carries across any language barrier, and what he wanted his voice to say right now was, "You can stop counting your heartbeats." She looked at his hands. Then she looked at his face. Then, very slowly, she uncurled herself from the corner and moved toward the opening of the cage. She was taller than he'd expected, maybe 5'4", 5'5", and she moved with a careful, deliberate grace that reminded him of someone who had been hurt before and had learned to map the space around them very precisely before they moved through it. There was something in the way she placed her feet, not tentative, not rushed, but measured in the way that a person is measured when they have decided that every movement they make will be intentional. She stepped out of the cage, stood up straight, and looked at Cal with those large dark eyes, and then at Petch, and then at the service corridor around them, cataloging each thing in turn with the systematic attention of someone building a complete picture before committing to any part of it. She said something, 3 syllables, rising inflection at the end. "I don't have a translator module for Jari," Petch said. "Nobody does. They're uncontacted." "I know." The girl said the 3 syllables again, and this time pointed at herself. "Oh," Cal said. He pointed at himself. "Cal," he pointed at Petch. "Petch." He pointed at her and raised his eyebrows. She looked at his pointing finger. She looked at his face. Then she touched her own chest and said, "Sorry." It wasn't quite that simple. The sound was more complex than 2 syllables, with a tonal quality that his vocal cords probably couldn't replicate, but he understood it as a name offered in return for names given, which was a more sophisticated social exchange than a lot of humans managed. "Sorry," he said. He wasn't sure if he said it right. She didn't correct him, which he chose to read as diplomatic acceptance. Petch said, "We should move. The Venice pickup window is in 2 hours, and if they check in early and find their cargo gone, this corridor is going to get uncomfortable." Cal stood up. He gestured down the corridor, the universal sign for this way, and Surrey looked at the gesture and then at him, and then walked in the direction he'd indicated, calm and precise, like someone who had decided to trust him and was going to commit to that decision regardless of what it cost her. He hoped he was worth the commitment. The Tessarine was a battered cargo hauler of the mid-range class, old enough to have character and young enough to still be worth flying. She had a main cargo hold the size of a large apartment, a crew cabin with 2 bunks and a pull-out bunk that neither Cal nor Petch ever used because neither of them wanted to be the one to use the pull-out bunk, a bridge that was mostly console and not much window, and a galley that had been retrofitted twice and still couldn't reliably heat anything above 60 degrees Celsius. Surrey walked through it with the careful, cataloging attention of someone building a map. She touched things, the galley counter, the edge of a console, the door frame of the cargo hold, and her hands were precise and measured, like she was noting dimensions. The bioluminescent patterns on her temples shifted through several configurations Cal couldn't interpret. He noticed that she made no sounds while she moved, not no footsteps, but no incidental sounds. No brushing against things, no hesitations that produced a shuffle. Everything she did was considered. Petch gave her one of his emergency ration packs, which she turned over in her hands for a long time before identifying the peel-seal corner and opening it with a delicacy that suggested she understood sealed containers well enough to figure them out from first principles. She ate it slowly and methodically and without apparent enjoyment, like someone refueling rather than eating. Halfway through, she paused and looked at Cal with an expression he couldn't fully read, something evaluative, something that was asking a question he didn't have the language to answer yet. "She's not from a pre-technological society," Petch said quietly. They were on the bridge, pre-flighting the departure sequence, with Surrey in the doorway watching them work. "The way she moves around the ship, she's not scared of the machinery." "She's scared of us," Cal said. "Not anymore," Petch said. "Look." Cal looked. Surrey had moved from the doorway into the bridge proper and was standing behind the co-pilot's console, Petch's seat, not touching it, but studying the display layout with the focused attention of someone reading a text in a language they mostly knew. Her eyes moved from display to display in the same way a person's eyes moved when they were parsing a system, not when they were experiencing it for the first time. "She understands instrumentation," Petch said. "Or she understands the concept of instrumentation. Somebody gave her some kind of technological education." "Which means she's from somewhere," Cal said. "Not just an uncontacted species floating around the outer rim waiting to be sold by the kilogram." "Which means somebody sold her," Petch said, and left the rest of it unsaid, because neither of them needed the rest of it elaborated. Cal filed the departure request with Calyx Station, paid the docking extension fee that left them with exactly 43 credits in liquid assets, and began the ignition sequence. The Tessarine's drives came up with the usual rumble that sat just below alarming, the sound of a ship that was working hard and knew it, and was doing it anyway. Surrey sat down in the co-pilot's seat. Petch stared at her. She looked back at him with the calm, direct attention of someone who had decided where she was going to sit and was prepared to defend the decision rationally. Petch looked at Cal. Cal shrugged and took the pilot's seat. "It's your chair," he told Petch. "It's my chair," Petch agreed. He pulled up a jump seat from the wall console and sat in that instead, without further comment, which was one of the things Cal genuinely valued about him. They undocked from Calyx Station in the middle of a shift change, which meant the Korathi traffic control was minimal and the outbound lanes were mostly clear. Cal ran the departure sequence with one eye on the sensor board, watching for Venice transit signals. A Venice processing shuttle showing up on the dock while they were still in the departure queue would be a problem he didn't have a good solution to. But there was nothing. Either the Venice shuttle was running late or they hadn't checked in with the station yet, and either way the Tessarine cleared the departure threshold and ran her drives up to transit speed with nothing following them. Cal let himself breathe. Surrey was watching the departure display with complete attention, the station shrinking behind them, the stars resolving from the blur of dock lights to hard points in the dark. Her bioluminescent patterns had changed again, faster now, cycling through something that might have been excitement or might have been calculation or might have been something that didn't have a human name. She said something, not the 3 syllables from before, something longer, more complex. She said it looking at the departure display, and then she looked at Cal, and the direct quality of her attention was so precise that he had the unsettling feeling that she was about to tell him something important and was frustrated that she didn't have the words. He recognized that feeling from both sides of it. He'd spent the better part of 6 months on Praxis IV before he'd learned enough of the local dialect to stop being a liability in every dockside negotiation. And there was a particular quality of frustration in trying to communicate across a gap that big, the sense of having things to say and no vessel to carry them. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." The cargo run for Vellum Transit took them on a route that skirted the inner calyx belt, which was dusty and full of the kind of spatial debris that required constant micro-adjustments to the navigation array, and gave Petch the expression he wore when he was trying not to show that he was nervous. Petch had been navigating this class of route for longer than Cal had been flying, and he was very good at it. But good at something and comfortable with something were different, and the calyx belt made everyone who flew it uncomfortable. Suri watched him navigate with the same focused attention she'd applied to everything else on the ship, and about 40 minutes into the run she leaned forward and touched a single key on the navigation panel. Not the console she wasn't supposed to touch, but the secondary array, the one that Petch used for computational support, and the display reconfigured to show a debris field overlay that Petch had been manually calculating in his head. They both stared at her. She looked at the display, she looked at Petch. She touched another key, and the overlay scaled to show the next 3 hours of their route with the debris fields mapped and the safe transit corridors highlighted in blue. It was precisely correct. Cal checked it against Petch's manual calculations from the last 20 minutes. It matched. She just did in about 30 seconds what would take me 40 minutes of manual calculation, Petch said. I know. She understands our navigation system. She figured it out in about 40 minutes by watching you work. Petch was quiet for a moment. Cal, he said carefully, I want to revisit the part where I said don't anthropomorphize. What about it? I want to take it back. Suri made a sound that Cal was willing to bet, based on nothing except instinct and 11 years of reading people across a dozen species, was something close to satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of someone who has shown off, the quieter satisfaction of someone who has been understood. The Vellum Transit cargo drop was uneventful, a medical supply cache to a relay station on the calyx belt's inner edge, staffed by a rotating crew of 3 who looked deeply relieved to see Cal's dock certification and deeply uninterested in the blue-gray person sitting in the co-pilot's seat. The second payment transferred as promised. Cal did the math for the 4th time, confirmed they had enough for fuel and a small buffer, and filed their next jump request for the Tessarine corridor. On the way back across the belt, Petch said, she has to go somewhere. I know. We can't keep her on the ship. I know that too. She's not cargo. She's not crew, not officially. She's a person we bought out of a market cage, and the moment we cross into Korathi space again, any Korathi port authority has the right to reclassify her as. I'm not crossing into Korathi space, Cal said. Petch looked at him. The Tessarine corridor goes through the Korathi buffer zone. There's a secondary route through the Veth system. Takes 12 more hours but stays in neutral space. The Veth system route costs an extra 200 credits in jump fuel. I know. We have. I know, Petch. Another silence. The calyx belt debris field drifted past on the display, and Suri's overlay tracked it with clean, efficient precision. You're going to take the long route, Petch said. It wasn't a question. I'm going to take the long route. Suri said something from the co-pilot's seat. 3 syllables, but different ones this time, not her name, something else, said in a tone that was low and clear and Cal thought entirely deliberate, like someone making a statement, not asking a question. He looked at her. I don't know what that means. She looked at him for a moment with the large dark eyes. Then she pointed at the secondary route display she had somehow already pulled up on the console, the Veth system route, 12 extra hours, navigating through neutral space, and tapped it once firmly. She understands what we're talking about, Petch said. She's been understanding what we're talking about for the last 3 hours, Cal said. She just can't talk back yet. Suri looked at him when he said yet, and the bioluminescent patterns on her temples pulsed once, bright and fast, like the flash of a mirror catching light. The Veth system was named for the species that used to inhabit its inner planets, before the Korathi Combine had expanded through the sector 2 centuries ago and found more convenient uses for the real estate. There was nothing left of the Veth now but the system name and some archaeological markers that nobody visited, and a particular quality of light through the system's yellow dwarf star that was, Cal had always thought, very beautiful and very lonely at the same time. He thought about the Veth more than he usually did this crossing. He was on his second cup of galley coffee, 63 degrees. The galley was having a good day when Suri came and sat across from him at the crew table. She moved silently as always, and he had learned by now not to be startled by the way she appeared in spaces without announcing herself. It was not stealth, exactly, more the natural behavior of someone who had grown up in an environment where being heard first was a disadvantage. She had Petch's navigation tablet. She'd had it for the last 2 hours, and Petch had let her keep it, which said something about Petch that Cal had always suspected but had never felt the need to say out loud. She put the tablet on the table between them and turned it so he could see the screen. She had been using the tablet's stylus to draw, not randomly, with the same careful, deliberate precision she applied to everything. What she'd drawn was a system map, not the Veth system, not the Calyx belt, but something he didn't recognize, with specific planetary configurations and a series of notations in a script he couldn't read. The system had 7 planets, he counted them, with what appeared to be an asteroid belt between the 4th and 5th, and a binary companion star rendered small in the upper left corner of the diagram. In the corner of the map she had drawn, small and precise, a planet with 3 rings. She pointed at the planet with 3 rings. "Home," Cal said, not asking. The gesture was clear enough. "That's where you're from." She said something, longer this time, 5 or 6 syllables, and she said it looking directly at him with the patience of someone communicating across a gap they intend to close. "Not someday. Soon." "I can't read your script," he said, "but I can photograph the map and run it through a star chart database." He pulled out his own comm unit and took a photo of the map. The database was slow. They were in the Veth system transit window and the signal bounced, but after about 40 seconds it resolved a match. "Yaris system," he said, "way out past the Tessarine corridor, neutral space, not on any major trade route." He looked at the match. "There are no registered inhabited worlds in the Yaris system." Suri looked at him steadily. "Which means," Cal said slowly, "either the database is wrong or your people aren't registered." He thought about what Petch had said. He thought about the navigation overlay she had pulled up in 40 minutes and the route display without prompting, and the way she'd been using Petch's tablet to draw accurate stellar cartography from memory. Or your people were removed from the registry. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The Korathi Combine," he said. "They classified you as uncontacted." She held his gaze for a long moment, and the bioluminescent patterns on her temples cycled through something very fast, like a calculation reaching its conclusion. Then she reached out and took the comm unit from his hands with care, navigated to the star chart database, and began entering coordinates directly. Her fingers moved with confidence. She understood the interface without needing to be shown, which was the 3rd time in the last 12 hours that she demonstrated something that should have been impossible for a member of a species that had supposedly never had contact with the wider galaxy. The coordinates she entered resolved to the Yaris system on the main chart. Then she pulled up a second window, the commercial database, the one that logged registered species and combined classification records, and searched. Jari species, uncontacted outer rim pre-legal classification. Record date, 17 years ago. She had been classified as uncontacted before she was born. Cal looked at the screen. He looked at Suri. The bioluminescent patterns on her hands were very still. "They knew about you," he said, "and they classified you anyway, Because once you're classified as pre-legal, you can be sold. He sat with that for a moment. The galley heater ticked. The Tessarine's drives hummed somewhere below them, steady and mechanical and indifferent to everything human judgment had gotten wrong. "How many?" he said. She looked at him. He wasn't sure if she understood the question. How many of your people? How many classified? How many sold? But she held his gaze, and the light in her bioluminescent patterns went very still, the way it had in the cage, and that stillness told him enough. More than one, probably more than he wanted to know. He took his comm unit back and started running trade route logs for the Calyx market, the legitimate ones, the public ones, which were all that was accessible from a cargo freighter's database. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, something he could do something about. The thing about outer systems cargo runs was that you were always 1 degree removed from something terrible, and most of the time the smart move was to stay that 1 degree removed and keep your head down and your fuel tanks full. He'd always told himself that was pragmatism and not cowardice, and he had mostly believed it. He looked at Suri across the table. She was watching him with the direct, patient attention she'd had since the moment she'd first looked at him through the cage wire. Not scared now, or not only scared. Something else. Something that he thought, again with nothing to back it up except 11 years of reading people across a dozen species, was something close to assessment. She had decided to trust him. He had the feeling she was watching to see if the decision was going to hold. "Okay," he said. "Here's what I can actually do." She waited. That patience again, not passive, not submissive, but the patience of someone who understood that some information took time to arrive, and that rushing it produced worse information. "I can get you home. The Yaris system is 37 hours from here on our current fuel load. If we skip the Tessarine corridor entirely, we'd be running close to empty by the time we got there, but we'd make it." He pulled up the route on his comm unit and showed it to her. She studied it with the navigation overlay in her mind. He could tell her eyes moved in the way they moved when she was calculating something. "I can also log the Korathi classification record with the Outer Systems Ombudsman. I know it sounds like nothing. They're underfunded and mostly useless, and the Korathi Combine has better lawyers than anyone in the galaxy, but it creates a record. Classification challenges take time, but they can't ignore a formal filing from a neutral carrier." He looked at her. "And I can testify. If there's ever a tribunal, if anybody ever actually pushes back on the pre-legal classification, I can say I purchased a Jari from a Korathi market, and she demonstrated navigation capability, technological literacy, and the ability to communicate abstract concepts within 4 hours of first contact. That's not a pre-legal species. Any half-competent judge would know that." He wasn't sure how much of this she was following. He suspected more than he could confirm. "It's not enough," he said. "I know it's not enough, but it's what I've got." Suri was quiet for a long moment. The galley hummed. Somewhere in the ship Petch was probably running maintenance checks on the secondary drive manifold, which was his way of occupying himself when there was nothing to do but wait and think. Then she picked up the tablet again and drew something small, quick, not a map this time. A symbol. 3 curved lines intersecting at a central point, surrounding a circle, the whole thing contained within an outer boundary that looked like a stylized eye. She held it up so he could see it, then tapped it twice with her fingertip. Then she pointed at herself and at him. Cal looked at the symbol. He looked at her. "Is that a thank you?" he asked, "or a name, or something else entirely?" She looked at him with the large, dark eyes, and the patience of someone who understood that the answer to this question was going to take a while to fully translate, and that she had time, and that time was something she was prepared to give. He decided he was too. The run to the Yaris system took 39 hours, not 37, because the Veth system passage had a debris field that required routing around. but they made it on the fuel Petch had calculated with a margin of approximately enough to get home on, which Petch spent the last hour of the approach muttering about under his breath in the specific way he muttered when he was doing math that came out right and wanted credit for it. Suri spent most of those 39 hours in the co-pilot's seat. She slept there too, 4 hours in the middle of the second transit leg, curled in the chair with the same tidy efficiency she brought to everything, her bioluminescent patterns going slow and rhythmic. Cal had taken the watch and not woken her, sitting in the pilot's seat running the drives and listening to the Tessarine's old familiar sounds, and thinking about the Veth system and the Korathi database, and the outer system's ombudsman filing he'd started on the secondary console. He filled out the filing carefully. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't an advocate. He was a cargo hauler with 11 years of outer systems experience and a market receipt, and 3 hours of navigation logs showing something the Combine's database said couldn't exist. He wrote it all down in the flat, factual language of someone who knew that credibility came from specificity, and that specificity was the only tool he had. He submitted it at hour 31. The confirmation came back with a case number and a processing estimate of 18 to 24 months, and a note that a copy had been sent to the Korathi Combine Legal Affairs Division. He stared at that last line for a while. Then he filed a second copy with the Free Systems Coalition, which was smaller and louder, and had even fewer resources than the Ombudsman, but had a media liaison who was known to turn exactly these kinds of documented classification cases into front-page stories in the outer systems trade press. He knew about that media liaison because Petch had mentioned it once, offhandedly, as an example of something that never actually worked. He filed it anyway. You started the record. You gave it to as many people as you could. None of them said much for those last hours of the approach. The Yaris system was appearing on their long-range scanners, the binary companion first, then the primary star resolving from a bright point to a yellow-white disk, and then, one by one, the 7 planets. The 3-ringed one was the 5th. It resolved on the scanner with the slow inevitability of something returning, and Suri watched it from the co-pilot's seat, and her bioluminescent patterns ran through a long, complex sequence that he had never seen before, and that he thought, reading it the way he'd learned to read tone across a language barrier, was something like what a word like homecoming meant, in whatever language didn't have words yet for any of this. It was not a small word, he could see that from here. The Yaris system had no beacon, no registered docking infrastructure, no orbital platform. He brought the Tessarine in on manual approach, following Suri's guidance. She had shifted from passenger to navigator without ceremony, pointing at the display when he needed to adjust heading, and he followed her lead without question, because she knew where she was going and he didn't. They broke atmosphere over a world that was blue-green and heavily clouded, with mountain ranges that showed on the scanner like vertebrae beneath skin. The cloud cover was thick enough that he was flying mostly on instruments, and Suri directed him through it with taps on the display, and the occasional gestured adjustment of heading that he was beginning to understand the way you began to understand a dialect, not by translation, but by immersion. The landing site she guided him to was in a high plateau, sheltered on 3 sides by rock, with a flat stretch that was clear enough for the Tessarine's landing struts. He set her down soft in the thin, cold air of the plateau, and the drives cycled down to standby with the sound of machinery doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The hatch opened onto thin, cold air that smelled of ice and something floral that he didn't have a name for. The sky was dark blue, almost violet, and the 3 rings of the planet's moon system were visible on the horizon even in daylight pale arcs against the blue, catching the light of the binary stars at a shallow angle that made them look, for a moment, like something drawn carefully rather than formed naturally. Suri stood in the hatchway for a moment, not going out yet. She looked at the sky, she looked at the rock faces around the plateau, she looked at Cal. She said something, a full sentence this time, or what he thought was a sentence, with a cadence that felt considered and precise, the way people spoke when they were choosing their words carefully because the words mattered. He didn't understand any of it. He understood the weight of it. They were different things. She pointed at the tablet that Petch was still holding. She held out her hand. Petch gave it to her without a word. She drew the three-line symbol again, the one from the galley table, the same careful intersecting curves around the circle in the eye, and this time added something to it. A series of smaller marks arranged in 3 concentric rings around the symbol, each ring slightly different from the last. She held it up so they could both see it. "I think," Petch said, "that's how to find her again." Cal looked at the marks. They resolved, as he studied them, into coordinates, rendered in the Jari script he couldn't read, but mapped to the 3-line symbol in a way that he thought he could correlate to a standard stellar grid if he had enough time and a translation key. "That's a beacon point," he said. "That's where to come back to." Suri looked at him. She tapped the symbol once. She tapped the coordinates once. She pointed at herself and then at the gap in the rock face at the edge of the plateau, and then she pointed at the sky, not at any particular star, but at the whole sky, the gesture you made when you meant all of it, everywhere. "She's not alone," Cal said. Petch was quiet. "There are more of them," Cal said. "That's what she's telling us. She didn't just survive a Korathi market somebody sent her, or she was taken from somewhere that knows she's missing. She's going back to people." He looked at the symbol on the tablet screen. "And she wants us to be able to find them." Suri looked at him for one long moment with the dark eyes and the slow, bioluminescent light, and he had the sense of something being measured and found sufficient, which was more than he usually felt he deserved. It was the look of someone who has made a bet on an unknown quantity and watched it come in, and is noting the fact not with triumph but with careful, precise relief. Then she walked down the landing struts and out onto the plateau. She didn't run. She walked at the same careful, precise pace she'd used to move through the ship, and she crossed the plateau with the ring-arc horizon behind her and the violet-blue sky above her, and she stopped at the edge of the rocky shelter where the cliff face began, and she looked back once. He wasn't sure she could see his face from that distance. He raised a hand. She turned and walked through a narrow gap in the rock face and was gone. Petch was quiet for a moment. The thin air moved around them, carrying the unnamed floral scent that he thought, if he tried to place it, was like something between ice and green, growing things under cold. "She gave us coordinates to come back," Petch said. "She did." "Why would she do that? We're one cargo freighter. We're not exactly a rescue operation." Cal looked at the gap in the rock where she had disappeared. "I think she's working on a longer timeline than us." Petch considered this. "The ombudsman filing, you're actually going to follow up on it." "Already submitted it. Sent a copy to the Free Systems Coalition Media Office too." He paused. "I know what you're going to say. That the FSC Media Office has no teeth, and the Ombudsman has no budget, and the Korathi Combine will bury both of them in legal filings before the year is out." "Yeah, that. I was going to say it," Petch confirmed, "but I'm not going to say it now." Cal looked at him. "Why not?" "Because," Petch said, with the flat economy of a man who chose his words carefully, "she gave us coordinates to come back. She didn't do that because she's hopeful. She did that because she's calculating. And whatever she's calculating, she decided we were worth including in it." He looked at the Tessarine, old and battered and running lean on fuel in the violet light. "I want to know what she's calculating," he said. "That's all." Cal photographed the symbol and the coordinates before he touched anything else, filed them with the Ombudsman record, logged them in the ship's navigational database under a custom tag he created for the purpose, YARIS/ZHARI/return. He did not know if he would come back. He did not know if coming back would matter. He did not know if the Ombudsman filing would go anywhere, or if the FSC media story would get written, or if the Korathi Combine's lawyers would bury all of it under 3 years of counterfilings before a single judge had to look at a word of it. What he knew was this: he had a record, he had a case number. He had a market receipt with a date and a seller, and a price paid for a person who should not have been for sale. And he had navigation logs showing what that person could do, and he had a testimony ready in the event anyone ever asked him to give it. You could not fight the Korathi Combine with one cargo freighter. You could not undo what they had done to the Jari classification with a single ombudsman filing. You could not change the legal architecture of 300 years of convenient definitions by buying one person out of one cage on one station and flying her home. But you started where you were. You used what you had. You put things in writing and you put them somewhere they couldn't be ignored. And then you came back when you could, and you kept coming back, because that was the specific human stubbornness that the Korathi Combine, for all its lawyers and all its legal standards, and all its centuries of deciding who counted and who didn't, had never quite managed to account for in its calculations. They kept expecting people to stop. He raised the landing struts and powered the drives back up and set a return heading, and the Yaris system fell away behind them with its 3 rings and its violet sky, and the narrow gap in the rock face through which a girl had walked, carrying the coordinates to something that had not been found yet, and the patient certainty that it would be. Petch ran the fuel numbers one more time and confirmed they had enough to make Relay Station 7 on the return leg, which cost them their remaining buffer and probably a docking fee they were going to argue about later. "You know what the worst part is," Petch said, about an hour into the return leg without looking up from his console. "What?" "I'm going to want to come back too." Cal kept his eyes on the drives. "I know. I don't know why." "I think you do." Another silence. The Tessarine ran her old, reliable drives, and the stars moved past the viewports with the indifferent patience of things that had been there before any of this and would be there after. "The symbol she drew," Petch said, "the 3 lines. Did you figure out what it means?" "No." "Theory." Cal thought about it. 3 curved lines intersecting at a point, surrounding a circle, contained within an outer boundary shaped like an eye. The same symbol she had drawn in the galley and then again on the plateau with coordinates around it. Something she'd pointed at herself and then at him. "A witness," he said. Petch looked at him. "I think it means witness," Cal said. "Someone who saw and can say they saw, a person who was there." He pulled up the ombudsman filing on the secondary display and kept writing. The case number sat in the upper left corner of the screen, generated and time-stamped and now in the system, impervious to the kind of amnesia that the outer systems ran on. You could close your eyes to something. You could not unfile a record. He wrote until the relay station came up on the long-range display, and then he kept writing after that, because there was more to say and he had the time, and somewhere on a high plateau under a violet sky with pale rings arcing along the horizon, a girl was walking through a gap in a rock face toward people who were waiting for her, and he thought that whatever she was going to tell them, part of what she was going to tell them was this: there are humans out there. Some of them stop when you look at them through the wire. Remember that. He woke from a 3-hour sleep on the return leg to find Surrey, and then remembered with a lurch that Surrey was not on the ship. There was no one in the co-pilot's seat. The bridge was quiet except for Petch running his numbers at the side console, and the stars were the same stars they always were, and the Tessarine was running on fumes and math and Petch's quiet competence. He sat in the pilot's seat and looked at the empty co-pilot's seat for a moment. "You're doing it again," Petch said without looking up. "What?" "The thing where you stare at something that isn't there." Cal looked away from the empty seat. "How's the fuel?" "Thin. We'll make Relay 7 with enough margin to argue about whether we need to pay for docking or can top up and go. I vote argue. We always argue. We always win, Petch said. Or we lose and we pay the fee, and we argue about it on the way out. Cal pulled up the secondary display and looked at the ombudsman filing again. He had read it 4 times in the last 12 hours. It said what it said, factual, specific, documented, and he didn't think it was wrong, but he was aware that good documentation in the wrong hands at the wrong moment was just good paperwork. The question was the hands. He thought about Surrey navigating the Tessarine's displays in 40 minutes. He thought about the star chart she had drawn from memory, accurate down to the binary companion star. He thought about the database entry, 17 years ago, Jari species, uncontacted, pre-legal, and the date on that entry relative to her apparent age. He thought about who else the Korathi Combine might have sold over 17 years, from a species they knew was sapient, and had classified as not. He pulled up the Calyx station market records, the public access logs, the ones any registered carrier could request, and submitted a data query, Jari species, market transactions, all dates. The database took 6 minutes to process. It came back with 63 entries. 63 transactions, spanning 14 years, all logged as premium protein grade, outer rim pre-legal. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Petch appeared at his shoulder, looked at the screen, and did not say anything for a long moment. 63, he said finally. From Calyx station alone, Cal said. There are 11 other Korathi-operated market stations on the outer rim. You think they're all running Jari transactions? I think they classified an entire species as pre-legal for a reason, and I think the reason was commercial. Petch sat down on the jump seat. He looked at the display with the flat gray eyes that had seen a lot of things in the outer systems, and had mostly chosen not to say so. The FSC media contact, he said. Yeah. You should send them the market records, not just the classification filing, the actual transaction history. I know. That's a story, Petch said. Not a legal case. A story. The legal case can take 20 years. A story can take 20 minutes if the right person writes it and the right people read it. Cal looked at him. Since when do you think about media strategy? Since a girl handed us coordinates and walked into a rock face, Petch said. Since then I've been thinking about a lot of things. He paused. She's not the only one they sold. She knows that. That's why she gave us the coordinates to come back. She needs someone to make noise on the outside while she does whatever she's going to do on the inside. Cal thought about this. She picked us up in about 4 hours, he said. She had us figured out before we left the dock. Yeah. She was looking at me before I started looking at her. I know. Cal thought about that too. Thought about what it meant to be someone who had been put in a cage by people who decided you weren't a person, and who had spent however long it took for a Korathi market shuttle to transport you from wherever you'd been taken from to a market bay on Calyx station, watching the bay, watching the buyers, watching the faces passing the cage, looking for something specific. She had been looking for someone who would stop. Not someone who would fix it, not a hero, not a legal advocate or a galactic champion or anyone with resources or power or a plan. Someone who would stop and look and not look away. He'd been that person, barely. By the margin of 1 credit chip and 1 cargo run and 1 stubborn conversation with a Korathi market handler who charged 200 credits an hour for the privilege of changing his mind. We should go back, he said. I know, Petch said. As soon as we can refuel and pick up a cargo run in the Tessarine corridor. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I know. You're not going to argue about the fuel math. Petch looked at the 63 transactions on the screen. Not this time, he said. They were quiet for a moment, and the Tessarine ran her drives through the dark, and the relay station was still 4 hours out on the display, and the stars were the same stars, indifferent and permanent and full of things that had not been found yet. "I'm going to need a better database than the public access logs," Cal said, "if I want to correlate Jari transactions across all 11 stations. There's a data broker in the Tessarine corridor, sells access to Korathi commercial records, technically a gray market operation, but the records themselves are legitimate, just paywalled. Costs about 400 credits for a full species transaction history." "We don't have 400 credits." "We will," Petch said, "after the next run." Cal nodded. He added a note to the ombudsman filing request pending for full transaction history, commercial database access, Tessarine corridor broker, and saved it, and looked at the case number one more time. He thought about 63. He thought about 14 years. He thought about 11 stations. Then he stopped thinking and started drafting the message to the FSC media contact, because Petch was right that a story moved faster than a legal case, and there was a story here, specific and documented and already in the record, waiting for someone to read it and decide it mattered. He sent it before Relay 7 came up on the display. He didn't know if it would matter. He couldn't know that. What he knew was that the symbol Surrey had drawn, the 3 curved lines, the circle, the eye, was sitting in his navigational database under a tag he'd created, in a record he'd started, attached to a filing that had a case number and a timestamp, and was now in a system that was very bad at forgetting things. He had made a record. The Tessarine came up on Relay 7's approach vector, and Petch began the docking request, and the fuel argument started exactly on schedule, and Cal argued it on autopilot while keeping one eye on the secondary display where the message confirmation was sitting, sent and received. From a media contact at the FSC who would decide in the next 12 hours whether a story about 63 transactions and a pre-legal classification, and a girl who could navigate an unknown ship in 40 minutes, was worth putting in front of readers who might care about what happened out here, in the systems that most people preferred not to think about too carefully. He thought she would decide it was. He thought about Surrey walking through the gap in the rock face and whatever was on the other side of it, the people waiting, the things she was going to tell them, the longer timeline she was working on. He paid the docking fee. He'd be back.